The letter arrived at Julia Hartwell's boarding house room in Boston on a Tuesday morning in March of 1878, and by the following dawn, she had already made the decision that would carry her 2,000 miles westward toward a man she had never met and a life she could barely imagine. Julia pressed her fingers against the train window as the landscape transformed from the familiar cobblestones and brick buildings of Massachusetts to the endless stretches of prairie grass that seemed to roll on forever beneath a sky so vast. It made her heart ache with a mixture of wonder and terror. She was 22 years old, orphaned for 3 years now, and carrying everything she owned in 2 worn carpetbags that rested at her feet. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels against the rails had become a kind of music over the past week, sometimes lulling her into fitful sleep, other times matching the nervous beating of her heart as she imagined the stranger who would be her husband. James Rutherford's letters had been kind if brief. He wrote of his ranch outside White Oaks, New Mexico territory, of the cattle he raised, of the mountains visible from his porch at sunrise. He wrote that he was 30 years old, that he had built his home with his own hands, and that he needed a wife to share the life he had carved from the wilderness. He did not write poetry or make grand promises, but there was an honesty in his words that had moved Julia to respond, and then to accept when he proposed marriage through the mail. Now, as the train carried her closer with each passing mile, Julia found herself wondering what kind of man he truly was. Would he be kind? Would he be patient with her ignorance of ranch life? Would he look at her with disappointment when he saw that she was plain, with her mousy brown hair and 2 wide eyes, her figure too thin from years of stretching meager wages? The train lurched suddenly, and Julia grabbed the edge of her seat to steady herself. An older woman across the aisle offered a sympathetic smile, the same woman who had shared her lunch with Julia yesterday when the dining car prices proved too steep for Julia's carefully budgeted funds. "Nearly there, dear," the woman said. "White Oaks is the next stop." Julia's stomach twisted into knots so tight she could barely breathe. She pressed her hand against her midsection, trying to calm the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What had she done? What madness had possessed her to travel across the country to marry a stranger? She should have stayed in Boston, should have continued working at the textile mill despite the long hours and the lung-coating dust, despite the foreman's wandering hands and the wages that barely kept her fed. But there was no going back now. She had spent every cent she had on the train ticket. Her room at the boarding house had been let to someone else. There was only forward, only this unknown future rushing toward her as inexorably as the New Mexico landscape rolling past the window. The train whistle blew, long and loud, announcing their arrival. Julia's hands trembled as she reached for her bags. The older woman touched her arm gently. "Courage, dear. I can see you are frightened, but remember that he must be just as nervous to meet you." Julia tried to smile, but her lips quivered too much to hold the expression. She stood on shaking legs as the train began to slow, the brakes screeching and hissing steam billowing past the windows. Through the glass, she could see the platform coming into view, and standing on it, a handful of people waiting. Which one was he? Her eyes scanned the faces frantically. An elderly man with a white beard, a young boy probably waiting for family, 2 women in conversation. And then she saw him, and somehow she knew. James Rutherford stood apart from the others, hat in hand, his tall frame tense with the same nervous energy that coursed through Julia's veins. He wore clean clothes, she could see that much. Dark trousers and a light shirt with a vest, his dark hair neatly combed. His face was weathered from sun and wind, strong-featured, and even from this distance she could see the uncertainty in his stance. The train shuddered to a complete stop. Julia felt as though her feet had rooted to the floor, as though she could not possibly make them carry her forward to the door, down the steps, onto that platform where her future waited. But then the conductor was calling for passengers to disembark, and the press of people was moving around her, and she found herself swept along with the crowd, her bags clutched in white-knuckled hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. The heat hit her first as she stepped onto the platform. Boston had still been cold when she left, the last grip of winter holding the city in frost. Here, the sun blazed down from a cloudless sky, and the air was dry in a way she had never experienced, pulling moisture from her lips and skin. She blinked against the brightness, disoriented, searching for the man she had seen through the window. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was deep, gentle, uncertain. Julia turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his hat still in his hands, his brown eyes searching her face with an expression that mirrored her own fear and hope. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Rutherford." "James, please," he said, and he smiled, a small, cautious smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I am pleased to meet you, Miss Hartwell. Was your journey, did you? Are you well?" His awkwardness somehow made her feel marginally better. At least she was not alone in her terror. "I am well, thank you. Tired, but well. And please call me Julia." He nodded, still not moving closer. They stood there on the platform as other passengers reunited with loved ones around them, as baggage was unloaded and the train prepared for its onward journey. Julia felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, this first meeting with the man who would be her husband. And suddenly, the enormity of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had left everything. Everyone she had ever known, even the few distant cousins who had stopped writing years ago. She had crossed a continent to stand on this dusty platform in front of a stranger who was looking at her with the same wariness one might show a skittish horse. "I have a wagon," James said finally, gesturing toward the street beyond the platform. "We can load your things. The ranch is about an hour's ride from town. I thought perhaps you would want to rest a bit first. There is a hotel if you would prefer, or the preacher's wife, Mrs. Morrison, offered to let you stay with them until you are ready for the wedding. The wedding. Of course. They could not simply go to his ranch together, not without being married." Julia had known this, had thought about it during the long train ride, but somehow it had not seemed real until this moment. "When?" She started, then had to clear her throat and try again. "When were you thinking we might? That is, when would you like to?" "There is no rush," James said quickly. "I do not want you to feel pressured. You have come such a long way. You should take time to rest, to be certain this is what you want." His consideration should have comforted her, but instead it made everything feel more fragile, more uncertain. What if she rested and decided she could not go through with it? What if he looked at her properly in better light and found her lacking? What if this entire endeavor was a terrible mistake? The panic that had been building in her chest suddenly overwhelmed her defenses. Julia felt her eyes fill with tears, hot and stinging, and she turned her face away, mortified. She never cried, had learned years ago that tears changed nothing, that they were a waste of water and salt and energy better spent on survival. But she could not stop them now. They spilled down her cheeks as she stood there on the platform with her shabby bags and her rumpled traveling dress. Everything she owned in the world amounting to so little. Her future hanging on the charity of a stranger who was already offering her escape routes, before they had even spoken more than a dozen sentences to each other. "I am sorry," she gasped, trying to wipe at her face with her gloved hand. "I am not usually. Please forgive me." She heard James step closer, and then his hand was gentle on her elbow, guiding her away from the platform, away from the curious stares of the townspeople. He led her to a wagon hitched at the side of the street, and when they were somewhat shielded from view by the wagon's bulk, he finally spoke. "There is nothing to forgive," he said softly. "You have every right to be overwhelmed." But his kindness only made her cry harder. Julia pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that wanted to break free. But they came anyway, wrenching through her body with the force of all the fear and grief and loneliness she had been holding back for so long. She felt James hesitate, felt the moment of uncertainty, and then his arms came around her, careful and tentative at first, then more surely as she did not pull away. He held her there beside the wagon on the dusty street of White Oaks, New Mexico territory, this stranger who had promised to marry her, and Julia buried her face against his shoulder and wept. She cried for her parents, dead these 3 years from influenza, leaving her alone at 19 with no skills and no prospects. She cried for the boarding house room she had shared with 2 other women, where privacy was non-existent and warmth was scarce. She cried for the mill where she had worked her fingers raw, where the overseer had cornered her twice before she learned to never be alone in the storeroom. She cried for every day of hunger, every night of cold, every moment of bone-deep loneliness that had led her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. And beneath all of that, she cried from pure terror of the future, because even now, even wrapped in the arms of this man who smelled of soap and leather and sun-warmed cotton, she did not know if she had made the right choice. She only knew that she had made the only choice that seemed possible. James did not speak. He simply held her, one hand coming up to rest against the back of her head, his touch gentle and steady. He did not tell her to stop crying or ask what was wrong. He just stood there in the New Mexico heat, holding a weeping woman he barely knew, offering the simple comfort of his presence. Gradually, the storm of tears began to subside. Julia's sobs quieted to shuddering breaths, and she became aware of how completely she had collapsed against him, how improper this must look to anyone passing by. She tried to pull away, but James did not immediately release her. "Take your time," he said quietly. "There is no rush." Those words again. No rush. As if time were something they had in abundance, as if the whole town were not likely watching and whispering about the mail-order bride who had arrived and immediately broken down in tears. But finally, Julia did pull back and James let her go, though his hands remained lightly on her arms, steadying her. She could not meet his eyes, could not bear to see pity or regret there. "I have made a terrible first impression," she whispered. "No," James said firmly. "You have made an honest one." Julia did dare to look up at him then, and what she saw in his face was not pity, not regret, but something that looked almost like understanding. His brown eyes were kind, she realized. Whatever else he might be, he had kind eyes. "I am not usually so." She searched for the word. "Fragile." "I do not think you are fragile at all," James said. "I think you are extraordinarily brave. You traveled 2,000 miles alone to meet a stranger. That is not fragile. That is courage." His words settled something in Julia's chest, some of the panic easing back enough that she could breathe more freely. She wiped at her face again, knowing she must look a wreck, her eyes surely red and swollen, her cheeks blotched. "I must look dreadful," she said. James smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face into something warmer. "You look like someone who has been very brave and is very tired. Come, let me take you to the Morrison house. Helen Morrison is one of the kindest women I know. She will help you get settled, and then you can rest. Everything else can wait." He loaded her bags into the wagon with capable hands, then helped her up onto the seat with a courtesy that spoke of careful upbringing. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Julia tried to gather her scattered thoughts, to make sense of what had just happened. She had cried in front of him. She had broken down completely within minutes of meeting him. By all logic, he should be having serious second thoughts about marrying such an obviously unstable woman. Yet he sat beside her now, calm and steady, guiding the wagon through the streets of White Oaks as if nothing unusual had occurred. The town was smaller than Julia had imagined. A collection of adobe and wooden buildings scattered along a main street, with mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Everything looked foreign to her eastern eyes, from the architecture to the vegetation to the quality of the light itself, which seemed to make every color more vivid, every shadow more stark. "It is very different from Boston," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "I imagine it must seem strange." "Everything seems strange," Julia admitted. "The heat, the dryness, the mountains. Even the sky looks different here." "You will adjust," James said. "It took me time as well when I first came out here. I am from Ohio originally. Came west 6 years ago looking for land and opportunity." "Did you find it?" Julia asked, grateful for the distraction of conversation, for anything to focus on besides her mortifying breakdown. "I did," James said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. "The ranch is not large, but it is mine. I have built it from nothing, and it grows a little more each year. I run cattle primarily, have about 200 head now. There is a creek that runs through the property year-round, good grazing land, a house that is solid if not fancy." He paused, then added more quietly, "It is a good life, Julia. A hard life in many ways, but a good one. I would not have asked you to come if I did not think I could provide for you, could give you a decent home." "I am not afraid of hard work," Julia said. "I have been working since I was 14 years old. I can cook and clean, and so I know I do not know anything about ranching, but I can learn." James glanced at her, something that might have been relief crossing his features. "I do not expect you to know ranching. I hope, that we can learn to work together, to build something together." The wagon stopped in front of a neat adobe house with a porch and flowers growing in pots by the door. Before James could climb down, the front door opened and a woman emerged, probably in her 40s, with graying brown hair and a warm, open face. "James," she called, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. "You have brought her. Oh, my dear, welcome, welcome to White Oaks." Helen Morrison enveloped Julia in a hug before Julia could even climb down from the wagon, and the simple warmth of it, the uncomplicated kindness, brought fresh tears to Julia's eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough for one day. "Thank you," Julia managed. "You are very kind to offer me your hospitality." "Nonsense, it is my pleasure," Helen said, pulling back to look at Julia properly. "Oh, you poor dear, you look exhausted. James Rutherford, shame on you for not bringing her straight here. Come inside, Julia. I have a room all ready for you, and I have been cooking all morning. You must be starving." Helen bustled Julia toward the house, talking the entire time about the journey and the heat, and how Julia must be feeling completely overwhelmed by everything. James followed with Julia's bags, and Julia caught his eye over Helen's shoulder. He gave her a small, encouraging smile, and Julia felt something in her chest ease just a fraction more. The Morrison house was cool inside, the thick adobe walls keeping out the heat, and Helen led Julia to a small bedroom that was simply but comfortably furnished. James set down her bags and then retreated to the doorway, clearly understanding that Julia needed space. "I will come by tomorrow," he said, "if that is all right, to see how you are settling in. There is no pressure about when we might." That is, you should take whatever time you need. Still awkward, still uncertain, but steadfast in his kindness. Julia nodded, not trusting her voice. After James left, Helen helped Julia out of her traveling clothes and into a basin bath that felt like the greatest luxury Julia had experienced in months. The older woman chatted companionably while Julia washed away the grime of travel, talking about the town, about the people, about James. "He is a good man," Helen said as she laid out a clean dress for Julia. "A bit quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but honest as the day is long. He has worked so hard on that ranch, built it up from raw land. My husband, Robert, he is the preacher here. He thinks very highly of James." "How long have you known him?" Julia asked, toweling her hair dry. "Oh, since he first came to the territory, must be 6 years now. He came to services regularly, helped build the church we have now, always willing to lend a hand when someone needs it. He has been alone out there for too long, though. A ranch is hard work for one man, and a home needs a woman's touch." Julia pulled on the clean dress, one of only 3 she owned, and Helen helped with the buttons down the back. "Did he say why he decided to advertise for a wife?" Helen's hands paused briefly, then resumed their work. "I think he was lonely, dear, and practical enough to know that he was not likely to find a wife out here. There are not many unmarried women in these parts, and those who have their pick of men. James is not the most socially outgoing fellow, tends to be more comfortable with horses than at dances. I think he figured his best chance was to be honest about what he could offer and hope to find someone who wanted the same things he does." "And what does he want?" Julia asked softly. "A partner, I think," Helen said. "A companion. Someone to share the life he is building. Children, eventually, I would imagine, though he has never said so directly. Mostly, I think he wants what most people want, to not be alone." Julia understood that longing all too well. She had been alone for 3 years now, and the weight of it had become almost unbearable. Even surrounded by people in the boarding house and the mill, she had been profoundly, achingly alone. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in Helen Morrison's guest room, Julia tried to imagine what her life might look like if she went through with the marriage. She would be a rancher's wife, learning to live in this strange, harsh, beautiful land. She would have a husband, someone to share meals with, to talk to in the evenings, to wake beside in the mornings. The thought of that last part, the intimacy that marriage would entail, made her stomach flutter with nerves. She was not entirely ignorant. The other girls at the boarding house had talked sometimes, sharing what knowledge they had, most of it probably wrong. Julia knew the basics of what happened between husbands and wives, but the reality of it, the actual experience, remained a mystery wrapped in anxiety. Would James be patient with her ignorance? Would he be gentle? The way he had held her today, careful and steady while she cried, gave her hope that he would be. But knowing that she would be expected to share his bed, to let him touch her in ways no one ever had, made her pulse race with fear and something else she could not quite name. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of endless prairies and a man with kind brown eyes who held her while she wept. James came by the next afternoon, as promised. Julia was helping Helen in the kitchen when the knock came, and her hands went still on the potatoes she was peeling, her heart immediately racing. "Go on," Helen said kindly. "I can finish these. Take him out to the porch, get some air." Julia wiped her hands on her apron, removed it, and went to the door with legs that felt unsteady. James stood on the porch, hat in hand again, looking as nervous as she felt. "Good afternoon," he said. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Julia said. "Would you like to sit?" They settled into the chairs on the porch, and for a long moment neither spoke. Julia searched desperately for something to say, some way to begin a conversation with this man who was supposed to become her husband. "I wanted to apologize again," she started, but James held up a hand. "Please, there is no need. I meant what I said yesterday. You have nothing to apologize for. Still, I am sure that was not how you imagined our first meeting," Julia said. "I do not know what I imagined," James admitted. "I have thought about it so many times, practiced what I might say, how I might greet you. But the reality is always different from imagination, is it not?" "Yes," Julia agreed softly. "Nothing is quite as I imagined either. Is that good or bad?" James asked, and she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Julia considered the question carefully. "Different," she said finally. You seem very kind. That part is better than I hoped." She saw something in his expression relax. "I am glad. I was worried that I might disappoint you." "And I was worried the same about you," Julia confessed. James smiled a little at that. "Then we are evenly matched in our worries." They talked for over an hour, sitting on that porch while the afternoon sun slanted across the street. James told her more about the ranch, about the work that filled his days, about the isolation that sometimes pressed on him during the long winters. Julia told him about Boston, about her parents and their deaths, about the mill work and the boarding house, carefully editing out the worst parts, the hunger and the fear and the foreman's hands. "You miss it?" James asked. "The city, I mean. The people, the activity." Julia thought about it. "I miss having my parents," she said. "But the city itself? No, I do not think I do. It was loud and crowded and dirty, and I was always alone despite being surrounded by people. That is a special kind of loneliness, I think, being alone in a crowd." "I know what you mean," James said quietly. "I felt that way in Ohio, in the town where I grew up, surrounded by people who had known me all my life, and yet I felt like no one really saw me, really knew me. That was part of why I came west. To find a place where I could build something that was truly mine, where I could be seen for what I was building rather than what family I came from or what my father had or had not accomplished." "Did you find it?" Julia asked. "I did," James said. "But a ranch is not a life by itself. I have the land, the house, the cattle, but there is no one to share it with, no one to talk to at the end of the day. I found myself sometimes going days without speaking more than a few words, and I realized that was not the life I wanted either." "So you decided to find a wife," Julia said. "So I decided to try," James corrected. "I was not at all sure anyone would respond to my advertisement. Why would a woman want to leave civilization to come out to the middle of nowhere to marry a stranger?" "Because maybe she did not have much civilization to leave," Julia said quietly. "Because maybe the life she was living was harder than the unknown could possibly be. Because maybe she was alone too, and willing to take a chance on finding something better." Their eyes met, and Julia saw understanding there, recognition of the loneliness they had both been living with, the hope that had led them both to take this enormous risk. "Julia," James said slowly, "I want you to know that you do not have to decide anything right now. You can stay with the Morrisons as long as you need. If you decide that you do not want to marry me, that this was a mistake, I will make sure you have the means to return to Boston, or to go anywhere else you might want." His words were generous, kind, but they sent a spike of panic through Julia's chest. Return to Boston? To what? To the boarding house that had already replaced her, the mill that would only take her back if she was willing to endure the foreman's advances, the city where she had no family and no real friends. "I do not want to go back," she said quickly. "Unless you are having second thoughts, unless you do not want to marry me anymore." "No," James said immediately. "That is not what I meant. I just want you to know that you have choices, that you are not trapped." But Julia felt trapped regardless, trapped by circumstances and poverty, and the lack of any real alternatives. Yet looking at James now, seeing the sincerity in his face, the genuine care he seemed to have for her well-being despite barely knowing her, she thought that perhaps this trap, if it was one, might not be so terrible. "I would like to go forward with the wedding," she said, the words coming out more firmly than she felt. "If you still want that." "I do," James said, "but I want you to be sure. I want you to have time to know me a little, to be certain." "How much time do we have?" Julia asked practically. "I cannot stay with the Morrisons indefinitely. They are kind to offer their home, but I do not want to impose on them for weeks." "A few days at least," James said. "Let me court you properly, even if it is only for a short time. Let me take you to dinner, show you the town, the ranch if you would like. Let us talk and see if we suit each other." Julia wanted to point out that whether they suited each other or not, she had few options. But she appreciated his attempt to give her agency in this situation, to make it feel less like a business transaction and more like a real courtship. "All right," she agreed. "A few days of courting." James's smile was relieved and genuine, and Julia felt her own lips curve in response. Perhaps this would work out. Perhaps kindness and loneliness and practical need could be a foundation for something real. Over the next 3 days, James courted Julia with a determination that was touching in its earnestness. He took her to dinner at the town's small restaurant, where they ate steak and potatoes while he pointed out various townspeople and told her their stories. He walked with her through White Oaks, showing her the general store, the church, the schoolhouse where a young teacher taught the handful of children whose families lived close enough to send them. Everyone they met seemed to know James, and all of them were curious about Julia, though most were polite enough not to ask too many direct questions. The women especially seemed interested, and Julia could see the speculation in their eyes, wondering about this mail-order bride, making their judgments. On the 3rd day, James asked if she would like to see the ranch, and Julia agreed immediately. She was curious about the place that would become her home, and more than ready to escape the confines of town and the watching eyes of the townspeople. They set out early in the morning, James driving the wagon with Julia beside him. The road wound through rolling hills covered in grass and scrub, with the mountains rising in the distance. The sky was impossibly blue, unmarked by a single cloud, and the air smelled of sage and dust, and something wild that Julia could not name. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it. The landscape was nothing like the green hills of Massachusetts, but there was a stark beauty to it that called to something in her soul, a sense of space and freedom that she had never experienced in the crowded city. "Wait until you see the ranch," James said, and there was pride in his voice that made Julia smile. The ranch, when they reached it, was not what Julia had expected. She had imagined something rough, perhaps barely more than a shack. But the house James had built was solid and well constructed, a low adobe structure with a porch that ran along the front, windows that would let in light, a roof that looked sound. It was simple, yes, and certainly not large, but it looked like a real home. "I built most of it myself," James said as he helped her down from the wagon. "My neighbor to the south, Tom Henderson, he helped with the roof. But the rest I did over the course of 2 years, working on it whenever I had time between the cattle work." They walked toward the house, and Julia could see the barn beyond it, the corrals, the outbuildings. Everything was neat and well maintained, speaking of James's care and attention. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished but clean. There was a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a fireplace on one wall, a stove for cooking, a table with chairs. 2 doors led to what Julia assumed were bedrooms. "The bedroom on the right is mine," James said, his ears going slightly red. "The one on the left I have been using for storage, but I thought it could be yours. I mean until. If you want separate rooms, that is, I do not expect. What I mean is." Julia took pity on his awkwardness. "Thank you," she said simply. "That is very thoughtful." James showed her the rest of the house, including the room he had set aside for her. It was small but had a window that looked out over the valley, and Julia could imagine making it comfortable, could picture herself waking to that view. "What do you think?" James asked, and she could hear the anxiety in his voice, the hope that she would find it acceptable. "I think it is wonderful," Julia said honestly. "I think you have built something to be proud of." Relief washed over James's face. "I am glad. I know it is not fancy, not like what you might have been used to in Boston." Julia almost laughed at that. "James, I shared a room with 2 other women in a boarding house that had rats in the walls and ice on the inside of the windows in winter. This is a palace in comparison." He looked startled, and Julia realized she had revealed more than she had intended about her previous circumstances. But instead of pity, what she saw in James's face was a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her breath catch. "You will never have to live like that again," he said quietly. "I promise you that. It will not always be easy here, and there will be hard times, but you will have a home, Julia. A real home." Something cracked open in Julia's chest, some wall she had been holding in place through sheer will since her parents died. This man, this near stranger, was offering her not just marriage but sanctuary, not just a roof over her head but a home. How could she not say yes to that? "I would like to marry you," she said, the words coming out steady and sure. "Not because I have no other choice, though that is true enough, but because I think we could make a good life together. Because you are kind and honest, and I believe we want the same things. A home, a partner, something to build together." James crossed the room to her, moving slowly as if afraid she might startle. He took her hands in his grip warm and calloused from work. "I would be honored to marry you, Julia Hartwell," he said. "And I will do everything in my power to make you happy, to give you a good life. I cannot promise it will always be easy, but I can promise I will always be honest with you, always treat you with respect, always do my best by you." "That is all I can ask," Julia said, and then, gathering her courage, she rose on her toes and pressed a quick, shy kiss to his cheek. James's eyes widened, and a slow smile spread across his face. "We should get back to town," he said, his voice a little rough. "Tell the Morrisons, make arrangements with Reverend Morrison for the wedding." They were married 2 days later in the small church, with Helen Morrison and her husband as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople in attendance. Julia wore her best dress, which was still worn and plain, but Helen had lent her a lace shawl that made her feel almost pretty. James wore a suit that looked new, and Julia wondered if he had bought it specially for the occasion. The ceremony was simple and short. Julia's hands trembled as she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor this man she had known for less than a week. James's voice was steady as he made the same promises to her, and when Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her gently, a brief press of lips that nonetheless made Julia's heart race. They had a small celebration at the Morrison house, with cake that Helen had baked and toasts from the few people in attendance. Julia smiled and thanked everyone, and tried not to think about what would happen when she and James left, when they drove back to the ranch, when they were alone together as husband and wife. The sun was setting when they finally departed, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took Julia's breath away. She sat beside James in the wagon, wearing a simple gold band on her finger, legally and permanently bound to this man. "You are very quiet," James said as they drove. "Are you all right?" "I am nervous," Julia admitted. About tonight, James was quiet for a moment. "I am nervous too," he finally said. "I want you to know, Julia, that I will not rush you. I know this is all very new, very strange. We can take things slowly." His words should have comforted her, but Julia found herself thinking practically. They were married now. Certain things were expected, and putting them off would only prolong the anxiety. "I do not know what I am supposed to do," she said quietly. "I have never. That is, I am completely ignorant about." "That is all right," James said gently. "We will figure it out together." When they reached the ranch, James helped her down from the wagon and carried her bags inside. The house was dim, lit only by the fading daylight through the windows, and James moved around lighting lamps, creating warm pools of light. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I could make something." Julia shook her head. She was too nervous to eat. Instead, she stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure what to do, where to go, how to be a wife. James approached her slowly. "Julia," he said softly, "come here." She went to him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he had that first day on the platform. Julia leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "I know you are frightened," James murmured against her hair. "I know this is overwhelming, but I meant what I said in my vows. I will honor you, Julia. I will be patient and kind. We do not have to do anything tonight beyond sleep if that is what you need." Julia pulled back to look up at him. "But we are married now. Surely you expect." "I expect nothing that you are not ready to give," James said firmly. "We have time, Julia. All the time in the world. There is no rush." There were those words again. No rush. And finally, Julia let herself believe them. She reached up and touched James's face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble under her fingers, the warmth of his skin. "You are a very good man, James Rutherford," she whispered. He turned his head and kissed her palm. "Come," he said. "Let me show you your room. You can get settled and we can just rest tonight. Tomorrow we can start figuring out how to live together, how to make this work." But Julia found that now that the pressure was off, now that James had made it clear he would not demand anything from her, her fear was easing, transforming into something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "James," she said as he started to move toward her room, "I do not need my own room tonight. I would rather. That is, if you would not mind, I would like to stay with you." James's eyes searched her face. "Are you sure?" "No," Julia said honestly. "But I am your wife and I want to be a wife to you. I am nervous, but I trust you to be gentle. And I would rather face the unknown with you than hide in my own room." Something that looked like wonder crossed James's face. He took her hand and led her to his bedroom, where a large bed dominated the space. A lamp on the bedside table cast soft light across the quilts, and through the window, the last of the sunset painted the sky. What happened next was awkward and tender, and nothing like Julia had imagined. James was patient, true to his word, guiding her through unfamiliar territory with gentle hands and soft words. There was some pain, but there was also unexpected sweetness, and by the time they lay together in the darkness, Julia's fear had transformed into something new. Not love yet, perhaps, but the foundation of it, the beginning of real intimacy and trust. James held her as she had held herself on that first day, wrapped in his arms, but this time Julia was not crying. This time, she was smiling into the darkness, thinking that maybe, just maybe, she had found her way home. The first weeks of marriage were an education for both of them. Julia learned the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn to make breakfast while James went to tend the cattle. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, to wash clothes using rainwater from the barrel, to make meals from the limited supplies they had on hand. James taught her to ride, patiently working with her until she could sit a horse well enough to accompany him sometimes when he checked on the herd. He showed her the boundaries of their land, the creek that provided precious water, the places where the grass grew thickest. They learned each other's habits and preferences. James liked his coffee strong and his mornings quiet. Julia hummed while she worked and liked to watch the sunset from the porch. James was methodical and careful in his work, while Julia tended to rush through tasks to get them done. They navigated these differences with patience and humor, adjusting to the reality of sharing space and life. In the darkness of their bedroom, they learned each other in different ways. The awkwardness of the first night gradually gave way to greater comfort, to pleasure and genuine intimacy. Julia found that she liked being held, liked waking beside James with his arm across her waist, liked the private smile he would give her across the breakfast table that spoke of the night before. One evening about a month after the wedding, Julia was preparing dinner when James came in from the barn, his face troubled. She looked up from the potatoes she was cutting. "What is wrong?" she asked. James sighed, removing his hat and hanging it by the door. "One of the cows is sick. I am worried it might be spreading to others. If I lose too many head, it could be a real problem financially." Julia set down her knife and went to him. "What can we do?" "I will keep a close watch, separate any that show symptoms. Beyond that, not much except hope it does not spread." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I am sorry, Julia. I know this is not what you wanted to hear. I promised you security, and already I am talking about potential losses." "James," Julia said firmly, taking his hand, "I did not marry you expecting everything to be perfect. I married you knowing that ranch life would have challenges. We will face them together. What do you need me to do to help?" The relief on his face was profound. "You mean that? Of course I do. We are partners, are we not?" James pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Yes," he said against her hair. "Yes, we are." The sickness did spread, and they lost 5 cows before it ran its course. It was a financial blow, and Julia could see the stress it put on James, the way he would lie awake at night worrying about money and the future. She did what she could to help, stretching their food supplies, mending and re-mending their clothes to make them last, suggesting she could take in washing from some of the townspeople to bring in extra money. James was reluctant at first, not wanting Julia to have to work so hard, but she insisted. "We are in this together," she reminded him. "Your pride does not get to stand in the way of practical help." So Julia took in washing and mending from several families in White Oaks, and the extra money helped them weather the loss of the cattle. More than that, it gave Julia a sense of purpose and contribution, a feeling that she was truly pulling her weight as a partner in this enterprise. As summer deepened into fall, Julia found herself settling into her new life in ways she had not expected. She made friends among the ranch wives, women who understood the isolation and hard work of this life. Helen Morrison became a true friend, stopping by regularly or inviting Julia to town for coffee and conversation. The land itself became familiar, no longer strange and foreign but home. Julia learned to read the weather in the mountains, to recognize the plants that were useful and those that were dangerous, to move through this landscape with growing confidence. And James, her husband of circumstance, became someone she genuinely cared for, someone whose company she enjoyed, whose touch she welcomed, whose dreams she began to share. One evening in late October, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set when James took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about expanding the herd next spring, maybe adding some horses to sell, but it would be a risk, would require using most of our savings." "What do you think we should do?" Julia asked. "I think we cannot grow if we are not willing to take some risks," James said. "But I wanted to discuss it with you. It affects both of us, and I value your opinion." Julia considered. "I think if you believe it is the right move, we should do it. You know ranching better than I do." "I trust your judgment." James squeezed her hand. "Thank you for trusting me, for being a true partner in this." "Thank you for letting me be one," Julia said. "For not treating me like I am just here to cook and clean, but like my thoughts and opinions matter." "They do matter," James said. "You matter, Julia. More than I knew how to express when we first married, but I can say it now. You are important to me. This life we are building together is important to me." Julia felt warmth spread through her chest. "You are important to me too," she said softly. "I came here out of desperation, but I stayed out of choice. I stay out of choice every day, because this life with you is better than anything I had before, because you have given me a home, not just a house but a real home, and I am grateful for that." James turned to face her more fully. "I think I am falling in love with you," he said, the words raw and honest. "I know we married for practical reasons, but somewhere along the way it became more than that for me. You do not have to say it back. I just wanted you to know." Julia's heart swelled with emotion. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I did not expect it, did not even know if it was possible to love someone I married out of necessity. But you have been so kind, so patient, so good to me. How could I not fall in love with you?" James kissed her then, soft and sweet in the fading light, and Julia kissed him back, pouring into it all the feelings that had been growing in her heart over these months. That night in their bed, their lovemaking was different, infused with the emotion they had finally spoken aloud. And afterward, lying wrapped in James's arms, Julia thought about that first day on the platform, when she had cried from fear and uncertainty, and how James had held her then too, offering comfort to a stranger. He was not a stranger anymore. He was her husband, her partner, and increasingly, the man she loved. Winter came to the New Mexico territory with cold winds and occasional snow, though nothing like the brutal winters Julia remembered from Boston. The ranch work continued, harder in some ways because of the cold, but Julia and James had settled into efficient partnership, each knowing their role, working together to keep the cattle fed and healthy, the house warm, themselves cared for. Christmas came, and they spent it quietly at the ranch, exchanging small gifts. Julia gave James a shirt she had sewn, and he gave her a beautiful shawl he had commissioned from a weaver in town. They cooked a special meal and sat by the fire, talking about their plans for the coming year, their hopes for the ranch's growth. "I would like to add a room onto the house," James said. "Maybe in the spring, a proper parlor or perhaps—" He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. "Or perhaps what?" Julia prompted. "Or perhaps a nursery," James said quietly. "If that is something you might want, eventually. There is no rush, of course, but I thought if children are something you hope for." Julia felt a flutter in her chest. She had thought about children, wondered if and when they might come. "I would like that," she said. "Not right away necessarily, but yes, I would like to have children with you, to raise them here on this ranch we are building together." James's smile was brilliant. "I would like that too." "Very much." It was not until spring, however, that Julia realized her monthly courses had not come for 2 cycles. She waited another week to be sure, then told James one morning over breakfast. "I think I might be with child," she said, watching his face carefully. James went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but I think so. All the signs are there." James set down his cup and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Are you happy, frightened?" "Both," Julia admitted. "I am happy because I want to have your children, but I am also frightened because I have never done this before and my mother is not here to guide me, and what if something goes wrong?" "We will get through it together," James said firmly. "Helen Morrison has delivered half the babies in the county. She will help you, guide you, and I will be here every step of the way." As the months passed and Julia's belly grew, James was true to his word. He was attentive and patient, taking over the heavier chores without complaint, bringing her water when she was sick in the mornings, rubbing her feet when they ached in the evenings. Helen came out to the ranch regularly, checking on Julia, answering her endless questions, reassuring her that everything was progressing normally. The other ranch wives included her in their circle of mothers and mothers-to-be, sharing advice and stories and hand-me-down baby clothes. James built the nursery addition, working on it whenever he had spare time, determined to have it finished before the baby came. Julia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling with love for the child she had not yet met, for the life she and James were creating together. One evening in early autumn, almost exactly a year after they had married, Julia felt the first real contraction. James immediately sent for Helen, and then he stayed by Julia's side through the long hours of labor, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, offering what comfort he could. Their son was born just before dawn, his lusty cry filling the house with sound and life. James held him with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked from the baby to Julia and back again. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are amazing. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas, after James's father who had died years before. Thomas Rutherford, born into a life of ranching and wide skies, held in the arms of parents who had started as strangers and become partners and lovers and friends. Julia recovered slowly from the birth, and those first weeks with Thomas were exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful all at once. James helped whenever he could, taking the baby in the middle of the night so Julia could sleep, learning to change diapers and swaddle and soothe. Watching James with their son, seeing the gentle competence with which he handled the tiny baby, Julia felt her love for her husband deepen even further. This was the man who had held her while she cried on a train platform, who had given her time to adjust, who had built a home and a life with her. And now he was the father of her child, and she could not imagine her life without him. Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. The ranch prospered too. James's risk of expanding the herd paid off, and they sold cattle and horses at good prices that allowed them to add to their savings, to make improvements to the house and barn. When Thomas was 2 years old, Julia became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in the spring, smaller than Thomas had been but equally healthy, with James's brown eyes and Julia's stubborn chin. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, of seasons turning and children growing. James and Julia worked side by side, raising their children, building their ranch, deepening the love that had started from such uncertain beginnings. One evening, when Thomas was 5 and Sarah was 3, Julia stood on the porch watching her children play in the yard while James finished his work in the barn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the train in White Oaks, who had cried in the arms of a stranger, who had been so terrified of the future. She thought about how James had held her then, offering comfort without expectation, giving her time and patience and kindness. Those tears had long since dried, replaced by smiles and laughter and the deep contentment of a life well lived. The ranch was thriving. The children were healthy and happy. And James, her husband of 7 years, was walking toward her now from the barn, his face lighting up when he saw her waiting on the porch. "What are you thinking about?" he asked as he climbed the steps and pulled her into his arms, both of them watching their children play. "I am thinking about that first day," Julia said, "when I could not stop crying and you held me until I could breathe again." James kissed the top of her head. "I was so nervous that day. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that you would take one look at me and want to leave." "I thought the same thing," Julia admitted. "I was so scared, so convinced that I had made the worst decision of my life." "And now?" James asked softly. Julia turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face, this beloved face that had become as familiar to her as her own. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made. You gave me a home, James. You gave me love and partnership and family. You held me when I was crying, and you did not let go until I was ready to smile again." "And you gave me the same," James said. "You took a chance on a lonely rancher who did not know how to express what he was feeling. You built this life with me, made this house a home, gave me children and love and purpose. I fall more in love with you every single day, Julia Rutherford." Julia kissed him, pouring into it all the love she felt, all the gratitude for the life they had built together. From the yard, Thomas called for them to come see something he had found, and Sarah was tugging on her brother's sleeve, trying to get his attention. James and Julia broke apart, smiling at each other with the easy intimacy of long partnership, and walked hand in hand down the porch steps to see what adventure their children had discovered. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew tall and serious, following his father around the ranch, learning everything James could teach him about cattle and horses and the land. Sarah was more like Julia, practical and determined, always finding ways to help, always asking questions, always pushing to be included in the work. When Thomas was 8, James taught him to ride properly, and the boy took to it like he had been born in the saddle. Julia watched from the porch, her hand resting on her rounded belly, pregnant again with their third child. This pregnancy had been unexpected, a surprise after 5 years, but welcome nonetheless. Their second son, Daniel, was born that winter, and he was different from the other two from the start. Where Thomas had been serious and Sarah determined, Daniel was joyful, laughing at everything, finding delight in the smallest things. He brought a new kind of energy to the household, and even Thomas and Sarah, who had initially been uncertain about a new sibling, quickly fell in love with their baby brother. The ranch continued to grow. James hired a hand to help with the work, a young man named Peter who had come west looking for opportunity. With the extra help, James was able to expand their operations further, and the ranch became one of the more successful in the area. Julia started a small vegetable garden that grew each year, providing fresh produce for their table and extras to sell in town. She became known for her preserves and pickles, and soon she was taking orders from townspeople, adding another small stream of income to the ranch's finances. Helen Morrison remained a close friend, and as the years passed, Julia became the person other new brides turned to for advice and support. She remembered her own fear and uncertainty, and she tried to offer to others what Helen had given her: kindness, patience, and the assurance that they would find their way. One summer evening, when they had been married for 10 years, James suggested they have a celebration, invite the neighbors and friends for a party. Julia agreed enthusiastically, and they spent weeks preparing, cleaning and cooking and getting ready. The day of the party was perfect, warm and clear, and people came from all over the area, bringing food and instruments for music. Children ran wild in the yard while adults talked and laughed, and as the sun set, someone brought out a fiddle and the dancing began. James, who usually avoided dancing, took Julia's hand and led her out to where the others were moving to the music. They swayed together under the darkening sky, and Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, overwhelmed with gratitude for this life, these people, this man. "What are you thinking?" James asked, echoing the question he had asked her so many times over the years. "I am thinking that I am happy," Julia said simply. "Completely, thoroughly happy. That is not something I ever expected to be able to say." "Neither did I," James admitted. "But here we are." "Here we are," Julia agreed. They danced until the stars came out, until their children were sleeping in piles with the other children, until the last guests had departed, and they stood alone in the yard of the home they had built together. As they walked hand in hand back to the house, Julia thought about the scared young woman who had stepped off the train so many years ago, who had cried in the arms of a stranger, who had taken the greatest risk of her life on the hope of finding something better. She had found so much more than better. She had found home. She had found love. She had found a partner who had held her through tears and stayed to share the smiles, who had built a life with her one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of kindness and patience at a time. The tears of that first day had long since dried, but Julia had not forgotten them. They had been necessary, those tears, washing away the past, making room for the future. And James had held her through them, just as he had held her through every difficult moment since, just as she knew he would continue to hold her through whatever came. They had started as strangers bound by necessity, but they had become something far more precious. True partners, best friends, and deeply, enduringly in love. The mail-order bride and the lonely rancher had found in each other exactly what they needed. And in building a life together, they had built something beautiful and lasting. As they settled into bed that night, James pulled Julia close, and she nestled against him with the ease of long practice, of 10 years of sharing this bed, this life, this love. "I love you," James murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Julia whispered back. And in the morning, they would wake and begin again, tending the ranch, raising their children, living the life they had created together from nothing but hope and courage, and an advertisement in a Boston newspaper that had changed everything. The children grew and the ranch prospered, but more than that, the love between Julia and James deepened with each passing year. They had built something real and lasting, had transformed strangers into soulmates, had turned tears into smiles and uncertainty into unshakable certainty. Thomas was 12 when he started talking about wanting to expand the ranch even further when he was old enough to take over. Sarah, at 10, declared she wanted to be a teacher and maybe start a school right there on their property for the ranch children in the area. Daniel, at 4, just wanted to ride horses and play with the ranch dogs and make everyone laugh. Julia listened to her children's dreams and hopes, and she thought about how different their lives were from hers at their ages. They had security, love, a home that was truly theirs. They had parents who worked together, who showed them what partnership looked like, what love looked like when it was built on respect and honesty and genuine care. One afternoon in early spring, Julia was in the garden planting seeds when James came to find her. He had been to town that morning for supplies, and he had a strange look on his face. "What is it?" Julia asked, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. James held out a newspaper. "I saw this in the general store. It reminded me of something." Julia took the paper and looked at where James was pointing. It was an advertisement section, and among the listings for farm equipment and livestock, there were several advertisements from men seeking mail-order brides. "I placed an advertisement like that," James said quietly, 12 years ago. "Looking for a wife, someone to share this life with, and you answered it." Julia looked up at him, seeing the emotion in his eyes. I did. It seemed like my only option at the time. I was so desperate, so scared. And I was so lonely, James said. So convinced that I had to do something, take some kind of action, or I would spend the rest of my life alone out here. We were both taking such a risk, Julia said. We could have been so wrong for each other. It could have been a disaster. But it was not, James said, taking her hands in his, heedless of the dirt. It was the opposite of a disaster. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. To me too, Julia said softly. I came here crying, broken, terrified, and you held me until I could breathe again. You gave me time and patience and kindness. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, James corrected. You saved me just as much as I saved you. You made this house a home. You gave me children and partnership and love. You made my life full in ways I had not even known it was empty. Julia set down the newspaper and wrapped her arms around her husband, holding him close in the spring sunshine. Around them, the ranch spread out in all directions, the product of years of hard work and careful planning. In the distance, she could hear Thomas talking to Peter about the cattle, Sarah reading on the porch, Daniel's laughter from somewhere in the barn. This was her life now. Not the one she had imagined as a girl in Boston, but something richer and deeper than anything she could have dreamed. She had traveled 2,000 miles to meet a stranger, and in doing so, she had found her way home. As they stood together in the garden, Julia thought about all the women who were out there right now, contemplating similar advertisements, weighing similar risks. She thought about the men who placed those advertisements, lonely and hoping, risking rejection and disappointment. Some of those matches would fail, she knew. Some would be disasters. But some, like hers and James's, would become something beautiful. Some would transform fear into courage, tears into smiles, strangers into soulmates. Come on, James said, releasing her and gesturing toward the house. Helen is coming for dinner tonight and Sarah wants to make a special dessert. We should help her. Julia smiled and took his hand, and they walked together toward the house, toward their children, toward the evening meal and the comfortable routine of family life. She glanced back once at the garden, at the seeds she had just planted, thinking about how small seeds could grow into something nourishing and beautiful with enough care and patience and time. The same was true of love, she thought. The same was true of family, of home, of the life you built with your own hands and heart. That evening, with Helen Morrison at their table and their children laughing and talking, with James beside her, and the ranch stretching out around them under the endless New Mexico sky, Julia felt a contentment so deep, it was almost overwhelming. She had stopped crying years ago, but she had never stopped being grateful. Grateful for the courage it had taken to answer that advertisement. Grateful for the kindness James had shown her from the very first moment. Grateful for every day of this life they had built together. After dinner, after Helen had gone home and the children were in bed, Julia and James sat on the porch as they did most evenings, watching the stars come out one by one. You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not answered my advertisement? James asked. If some other woman had, or if no one had, Julia considered. Sometimes, but not in a way that makes me wish things had been different, more in a way that makes me even more grateful that things turned out the way they did. I think about it too, James said. About how close I came to spending my whole life alone, about how one decision to place that advertisement changed everything. And one decision to answer it, Julia added. The best decisions we ever made, James said, putting his arm around her shoulders. Julia leaned into him, fitting against his side as naturally as breathing. The best decisions we ever made, she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky deepen from blue to black, watching the stars multiply until the heavens were crowded with light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and one of their dogs answered from the barn. This was home. This was family. This was love built on a foundation of kindness and patience, growing stronger with each passing year. Julia thought about that scared young woman on the train platform one more time, about the tears that had flowed so freely that first day. She thought about James's arms around her, holding her steady while her world tilted and reformed into something new. The tears had been necessary, she realized. They had washed away the fear, made room for hope. And James had held her through them, had given her time and space to grieve what she was leaving behind while she gathered courage for what lay ahead. He was holding her now too, not because she was crying, but because this was what they did, how they existed together. They held each other, supported each other, built their life together one day at a time. "I love you," Julia said into the starlit darkness. "I love you too," James replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always." Inside the house, they could hear Daniel calling for water and Sarah telling him to be quiet so Thomas could sleep. Julia smiled, recognizing the sounds of her life, her family. "I should go," she said, but she did not move immediately, savoring one more moment of peace on the porch with her husband. "I will come with you," James said, standing and offering her his hand. They went inside together, tended to their children together, and eventually made their way to their own bed, where they had shared 12 years of nights, where they had learned each other's bodies and hearts, where they had created the family that now filled their home with noise and life and love. As Julia drifted toward sleep, wrapped in James's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. 2,000 miles across a continent, from tears to smiles, from stranger to soulmate, from fear to love. It had been worth every difficult mile, every moment of uncertainty, every tear shed on that train platform so long ago. Because all of it had led her here, to this bed, this man, this life. The mail-order bride had found her home. The rancher had found his partner. And together, they had built something that would last for all their days and beyond, in the children they raised, the land they tended, the love they shared. Julia smiled in the darkness, feeling James's steady breathing against her back, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The tears had turned to smiles, and the smiles had become a lifetime of joy. And it had all started with a kind man who had held a crying woman on a dusty platform and promised her nothing but honesty and respect, then given her so much more. Everything she had ever wanted, everything she had never dared to dream, was here in this house on this ranch under the vast New Mexico sky. And every morning when she woke beside James, every evening when they sat together on the porch, every moment of their shared life together, she was grateful beyond words for the courage it had taken to answer that advertisement, to travel across the country, to trust in the possibility of something better. She had found it, they had found it together, and that was the greatest gift of all.